Hi, I'm Thomas.
And I'm Ben.
And today on the Philosophy Show,
we're going to discuss ethics.
And later on, we will move on to non-philosophical topics such as technocracy, absolute monarchy, and the role of automation on modern society.
All right, so we start with ethics. Well, I suppose I could start off by naming some different systems that have been suggested as attempts to put together a coherent system of how morality works. And so the first one is utilitarianism, which is a form of consequentialism, where consequentialism is a system in which it is the products of an act that define whether it is moral or not the act itself. So the ends justify the means kind of thing. And utilitarianism is the most popular form of this, which says that that is good which produces the most happiness for the most people. So, initial thoughts.
As you mentioned, it's very much so the ends justify the means. And, you could talk about how that was prevalent, especially in, say, communist societies where, they would undergo massive social unrest and, millions of deaths. But it was all justifiable by the state because the state would say, these guys are enemies of the state,
It's for the greater good.
Exactly, it's for the greater good, but the question is, the greater good of who?
Well, I had something I was going to say. I was going to say that whenever I try to argue for libertarianism based on moral principles, taxation is theft or something like that, whoever I'm talking to suddenly becomes a utilitarian and starts giving reasons about roads and fire departments and such things, despite the fact that that's completely irrelevant to the argument that taxation is theft, because, it's theft whether it creates roads or not, unless you're a utilitarian.
That is interesting, and one thing that I've actually heard is that there's this argument where, for example, if you know anything about Greece, its economy isn't doing so well. And one interesting thing about Greece is that essentially nobody pays taxes. They don't pay their income taxes. They try to fake the paperwork so they keep their money, and because of that, the government not only is deep in debt, but they don't have money to do anything with the theoretical sums of money they're supposed to get as revenue from their people. And if you have a government where the people aren't paying the taxes, that doesn't work. And what I'm saying by that is that if you want to not pay your taxes, privatization is the way to go. But if you are going to pay your taxes and have a government, you got to pay your taxes and have a government. You can't have a government and pay no taxes. Just like you can't... that was basically it, but yeah.
So we need to get rid of the government. Okay, let's do that. Okay, so continuing with utilitarianism, one thought I just had is if you've read Brave New World, that would be a utilitarian paradise, despite the fact that it's a dystopia, because everyone in there was always happy because they took that drug that I don't remember what its name is, that makes them happy. So, yeah.
And by that kind of explanation of Brave New World, it makes George Orwell's 1984 sound like a better place to live, not because you'll be happier, but at least you'll be somewhat aware and living a lie, but the lie sold to you by the government, not the lie you sell yourself. Although, I guess technically the same could be said for both of them. I don't know, I prefer to be in George Orwell's 1984 because I don't want to be no pill-popping hippie.
I'd rather not be in either.
Oh, yeah. Well, of course.
It goes without saying, but anyway.
Yeah. All right.
And so, do you know who Robert Nozick is?
I do not. I am going to get the impression that our viewers do not, so enlighten us, Ben.
He was a professor of philosophy at Harvard a few years back. He was the most prominent libertarian philosopher. He wrote a book called Anarchy, State, and Utopia, and it was won some big book award and stuff like that. And there was this other professor at Harvard named Rawls, and he was an equalitarian. He believed equality was the highest value and stuff.
When you say equalitarian, do you mean equality of opportunity or equality of outcome?
I think of outcome.
Okay.
And so he was sort of the intellectual advocate of leftism. And so they sort of, faced off and dueled intellectually through the years. In any case, Nozick he also did a lot of philosophy in different areas besides political philosophy. One of the things he came up with was this critique of utilitarianism. Or maybe I'm misattributing this argument to him, but he came up with some argument against it. Anyway, I'm thinking of the thought experiment in which there is this perfect society. Everybody's always happy, except this one kid who's locked in a closet and beaten and stuff. And by some magic power, the mistreatment of this child makes the society good. And so that would be good in utilitarianism, despite the fact that we would say that's not good, that's a violation of this child's rights.
And that's the thing with, the whole argument that the ends justify the means. First of all, quite frankly, I don't think humans are capable of any kind of perfect society by definition. There's a whole other philosophical argument for that, but by definition, humans are imperfect, therefore we cannot form a perfect society. And what leftists tend to do sometimes is kind of say, capitalism is the problem. Communism would work. We're capable of perfection. Communists would be the perfect society. It's capitalism that's holding us back. When in reality, quite frankly, I don't think that there's a perfect system because we are imperfect, and by definition, the fact that we're imperfect makes it so we can't come up with any kind of perfect society. We're incapable of recreating perfection without being it. You can make a whole argument, you could get into God and all that stuff, but I don't want to do that today. All that to say, perfect society not going to happen. But also, if you want to say, the ends justify the means, why stop at one kid? Why not beat half the population? Why not beat every single person on the world except for yourself? Would it be worth it then? Would it, Ben?
Well, I think that last example of everybody except yourself wouldn't count as utilitarianism, because that wouldn't create the greatest happiness for the greatest amount of people.
All right, that is true. Okay, how about half minus one people get beaten?
Yeah, I think that would work.
The thing with that is that even if I did believe a perfect society was possible, and believe me, what's it called? Utilitarianism?
Utilitarianism.
Okay, utilitarianism. It can be very tempting. It's very tempting to say, I'm willing to, put my name in a draw of millions of people, and somebody has to draw it and get their miserable life for the rest of us to be happy. It's very tempting to say that because first of all, the odds of it being you aren't that high, but second of all, even if it is you, you're probably going to regret it once you're the guy suffering. But, before that you're thinking, the suffering of one person for the helping of other people, I could justify that to myself, it's okay. And that's a very dangerous kind of thinking because it allows you to basically justify anything to yourself. And sometimes you got to look at the small picture, not necessarily the big picture. And you got to think, basically what I'm saying is that you need to take personal responsibility for what goes on. You can't just say, he's getting suffering so we could be happy. You got to think, but wait, I'm responsible for his suffering. Is it really worth it for me to live in this perfect society if others suffer? Would I not rather live in, a normal society where nobody suffers? Doesn't that sound like a decent alternative? And even by definition, that might even work into utilitarianism.
Yeah, utilitarian.
Utilitarianism, not a perfect society in which people have to get beaten, but the society we live in today where, sure, not everybody's equal, and you could say that capitalism is forcing poor people to work and rich people to profit off of it, and it justifies itself because middle-class people like us, consumers, are able to buy stuff at low prices because of the labor of the poor people. It doesn't mean I want to become a communist revolutionary. It doesn't mean that I'm a utilitarianism. But I do think that that kind of thing does come up in my head. I don't simply think, I'm not going to worry about it, they're doing it, it's helping more people. If I think about some poor Indian boy working in a sweatshop, I'm going to feel sad for him, I don't think anybody deserves that kind of life in terms of, not even having access to your basic rights. Am I going to donate money to some non-profit organization? No, because it's probably terrorism or something. Will I ever go to India? Probably not. I mean, it's kind of dangerous down there. I'm sorry if you're Indian, by the way. I'm sure there's nice places in India, but it's not necessarily my idea of a perfect vacation spot. Quite frankly, as leftist as it is, I kind of like Canada.
India is more leftist, I'm pretty sure.
Well, that's interesting because from what I understand, India, according to some ranking, I'm not sure how trustworthy it is, but it was considered the most racist country in the world. And I think that there's actually logic behind that, and that doesn't mean it's a bad place, but there's a long, long history of a caste system in which there's a very rigid kind of socio-economic structure where you're kind of stuck there, and it's very taboo to marry outside of your caste. And that kind of leads people to get, I am the more deserving person, I'm part of the higher caste. These people are, kind of subhumans. They're not as important as us, they're not as smart, they're not as strong. They're not, they're not the same as us, therefore I can justify, exploiting them because they're not really us. They're working to help us because we deserve it, because we are, the superior race, although they're both Indian. I don't know. I'm no expert on what goes on in India, but that's kind of my basic understanding. Again, I do apologize if you are Indian. You could totally argue with what I'm saying. But from what I've learned about India, very rigid caste system, and they don't like outsiders, apart from touristy areas.
Well, I'm pretty sure that the system it's part of their Hinduism. It's not like part of the country itself. But anyway, we've gotten quite off topic.
Mm-hmm, yeah. What was the original question?
You were talking about utilitarianism and the ends justifying the means and that being dangerous.
Yes, it is dangerous, and quite frankly, I don't think extremes are the solution here. I think that, first of all, for people to go to extremes, they gotta feel desperate. They gotta feel as if there's no other option, when in reality, for most people, unless you're about to get beheaded by ISIS or something, life isn't that bad. Jordan Peterson has this saying where he says, I actually got this from his, I think, sister. The whole thing is that, if you walk away at the end of the day without a crocodile on your leg, it's a good day. If you walk away at the end of the day with a crocodile on your leg, well, now you got problems. But any day you could walk away without a crocodile on your leg isn't the worst possible day you could have. And quite frankly, I think that there's a lot of pressure forcing people to think that, their life is so horrible, what am I going to do with this free time? I'm not a student anymore, I don't have a job. I guess the only solution is to watch videos on YouTube. But I think, quite frankly, you could say it's the government, you could say it's the media, but really, people's lives are better than they've ever been. If people have any kind of problems, it's because they have a lack of creativity. And Jordan Peterson actually mentions this in one of his videos. I'm sorry, I shouldn't make this about him, but he mentions that it's incredibly hard to live without a job. Let's say you got money, but essentially doing nothing all day. It's very difficult for humans to do nothing all day, because as soon as they lose a job or they lose something like that, they like the suffering. And I don't mean flagellants here, that's a whole other thing. But I'm talking about the suffering of, being a student, being at work, feel like you're contributing. All of a sudden you lose that, and then you start wondering, well, what's the point of my life anymore?
We are way off topic.
Okay, I'm sorry.
I think you may have surpassed me in a number of Jordan Peterson videos watched, by the way.
That is very possible.
Anyway, so I think one of the appeals of utilitarianism is that everybody, or almost everybody, is a utilitarian to a small degree. That is, you would consider it moral to lie in order to stop somebody from being murdered or something like that.
So the idea that everybody thinks that some ends justify some means.
Yes, for the most part. But now we're going to get to the people who don't, and that's the ethics system of Immanuel Kant. And no expert on it, but I know one of his categorical imperatives states that any act must be either moral in all circumstances or immoral in all circumstances. So you could not lie to save that person from being murdered. And in that old problem about the train going on 2 tracks and it's going to hit 5 people and you can make it hit 1, you would not be able to switch it over to make it hit just the one person. And so yes, this is quite the opposite of utilitarianism.
Right. And I think that I'm definitely guilty of utilitarianism in some senses where, for example, presented the classic train problem, I would most definitely pull the lever and directly cause that one person's death. Would I feel bad about it? Yes, it would probably haunt my nightmares, but I would be able to justify it to myself. And that's, of course, dangerous, where I constantly need to remind myself that, the means can't just justify the ends, and that just makes your life easy and you don't got to worry about it. I will feel guilty about it. I will feel, it'll weigh heavily on me. But in some instances like that, I would be willing to do that. And I mean, the question is, how far do you go with that? If it's, would you make it so instead of hitting a child, it hits an elderly man? And then it becomes, what's the science behind deciding whose life is more valuable than whose? And of course, it becomes very hard to do this, but sometimes in life, decisions have to be made where you have to decide who is more worthy of living. And then the question becomes, how do you decide that? And then that's how all these kind of schools of ethics, depending on what you adhere to, they'll argue with each other. I mean, I'm of the opinion that the human survival instinct is incredibly overpowering and that it'll do whatever it can to survive, even if that means doing things we would normally consider savage, such as cannibalism or, killing a bunch of people or stuff like that. The human survival instinct is incredibly strong, and it takes a lot of will to suppress it.
Another problem with this universality ethics thing is I'm wondering, how do you separate the act from the context? If we take murder and self-defense, is the act killing and murder and self-defense are just different contexts, or are they different acts altogether? And so that is one problem I'm having with this, and that is a problem I have not resolved for any moral system.
Yeah, I mean, one thing, and I don't think it's done this way, but let's say you're an outsider of some sort. I don't know, you're living on some lone island in Papua New Guinea with no contact with Western society, I don't know. And you just kind of walk in here, and then all of a sudden you are introduced to Western ethics, and you're kind of thinking, hey, this kind of seems a little bit arbitrary to me here, I'm no expert, but why do you think this means that, or why do you think this is more important than that? And they kind of get the impression that some of the things that society tells us is the right thing to do or is moral, all of a sudden isn't an absolute right. It's just a decision we've made. It's not like the absolute truth because society says it's truth. And then you could say the same thing about not just society, but, certain ethics of organizations or certain ethics of, different groups. And, an outsider can easily criticize them, but if you've lived with it your whole life, you essentially see it as truth. And how do you decide what's truth and what's just, what's the word I used? Arbitrary, yes. What's just kind of arbitrary? How do you separate that if you're in the system yourself?
I think you may be verging on moral relativism there.
And I am kind of doing that. I mean, this is more of a thought experiment than anything, but I do think it is a valid question in that it's good to question what you consider truth and your morals every once in a while, just so that if ever you discover a better option, you're more willing to take it than just kind of go with the first thing you were taught and forever be stuck there. Because maybe you do come to the perfect set of morals. Let's say such a thing exists, which maybe it does, maybe it doesn't, who am I to judge? But let's say you come across such a thing and you're convinced it's perfect. Does that mean that everything everybody else says you just don't even consider because you're convinced it's perfect? Or do you consider what they say, and if you think it's more perfect, you go with it? I mean, by definition, it can't be more perfect than perfect. What I'm saying is keep an open mind and don't necessarily be convinced, even when you think you found perfection, that it is perfection, because by definition, humans are incapable of perfection. So, I don't know, just keep your eyes open.
Okay. Well, I think my explanation for how we can know what's moral or not is our conscience. Anyway, so that's the end of utilitarianism and Kant. And I tried to come up with a solution to this, to the whole moral system. I couldn't exactly, but I thought, well, there's a correct thing to do, or something, or multiple possibilities of what you can do, or a rule about what you cannot do for every individual possible situation.
All right, so allow me to kind of decipher that statement there. You're saying that no matter what kind of situation you are in, there is, say, a right and a wrong choice, but us as humans...
Or an allowable choice.
Ooh, allowable, very relativist. Sorry.
No, not really, but anyway.
All right, so you're saying you got the good, the bad, and the allowable choice.
There's not necessarily all three of those for every choice.
Okay, all right. Oh, okay, so all right, so by that definition, for example, is it possible that humans don't realize that those options are those categories when they make a decision? Do they, for example, see things other than the way they really are? Do they maybe see an unacceptable option as an allowable option at the time, but then come to regret it later?
Quite often, yes.
Does that make them bad people, Ben?
Yes. Because they've committed an immoral act.
Does it make them irredeemable?
No.
Okay, all right, I like that. Okay.
Anyway, so if I continue. So I think the job of a moral system would be to figure out what pattern can describe what makes these categories true for any given circumstance.
So kind of like a science of ethics, you know, there's sciences for literally everything out there. There's a science of facial expressions, physiognomy, but anyways, so you're suggesting we establish some kind of science to kind of try to determine a perfect, or as close as we could get to that, moral system by identifying patterns and using things from biology, psychology, and all other fields to try to establish some kind of universally accepted moral system.
Well, I would not call it a science because it's not based on empirical means, and also I wouldn't bring psychology or any of those other things you mentioned into there. Just thought experiments, philosophy, and the conscience.
So it would be purely rational for you.
Well, also I should add using divine revelation, if you understand me.
Okay, so correct me if I'm wrong, but you're going to bring a bit of theology into there. And I mean, of course, there's an incredible connection between theology and morals and ethics in Western society. I mean, there's no way you could talk about ethics and morals without going into the theological history of Western society. So, of course, that has to be talked about. However, I do think that maybe not necessarily and directly determining this perfect moral code, but I do think there is some value into examining empirical fields such as psychology and biology to get a better understanding of why humans make the decisions they do, not necessarily determining the perfect code, but understanding why humans might not go along with this and trying to determine whether it's really evil or it's just a biological malfunction. And of course, you could say that it's not a biological malfunction, it's just a product of their character. Right? That sounds like a debate for another time.
Well, you could do that, but I don't see what that would have to do with determining what the pattern is for moral choices. Anyway, so I tried to come up with some rules, and I came up with two rules that I thought solved the thing that neither utilitarianism nor Kant could solve. And that's, the partial utilitarianism of everybody.
Okay.
And so the rules I came up with went like this. First of all, you are not permitted to commit an evil act that a greater good might result. However, you are permitted to and this is the second rule, you are permitted to commit an evil act that in an imminent greater evil might be stopped. not sure about those rules anymore, but I think they're better than both Kant and utilitarianism.
So if I were to sum it up, you can't justify an evil act to make things better, but you can justify an evil act if the alternative is a greater evil act.
Yes. And you are not required to commit the evil act that is allowable in that second circumstance.
Oh, so if you're saying if you're forced to choose one, it's morally okay to choose the lesser of the two evils?
Well, no, you don't have to be forced to choose one. You can either choose to do nothing in such a circumstance, or you can choose to do the evil that a greater evil might be stopped.
So you're saying that doing nothing and choosing the lesser of the two evils are both okay options?
Yeah.
Oh, well, I think that fits into basically almost what any human would do. I mean, unless you got a real evil person who will choose the greater of the two evils, but for the most part, I think either nothing or the lesser of the two evils would be the course of action of the majority of people.
Right. And so, that's all I got. I'm not quite sure if those two rules are right or not, but that's all I have for now.
All right, so Ben, do you mind if we switch over to a less philosophical subject now?
Sure.
All right, so I mentioned at the beginning of the episode technocracy, absolute monarchy, and the role of automation in modern society. Do you have a preference in any of those, Ben?
No.
All right, now I know you have a lot of things to say about absolute monarchy in terms of, well, I mean, I'm not going to spoil your opinion, but I think, if you don't mind, I would like to start maybe off talking about automation and how it'll affect today and tomorrow.
Okay. And so your thoughts are?
All right, so I'm by no definition an expert on the subject. I'm just a lowly SAGEP student who's read a couple articles. But based off of my conceptualization of it and what I've read, current projections are talking about massive loss of jobs and automation replacing things. And there's been a couple described solutions. I mean, one of the popular solutions proposed, especially by leftists, is tax the robots. And by that, they don't...
Wasn't it Zuckerberg who put that forth?
I actually think it might have been the Microsoft guy, Bill Gates. I'm not sure.
Oh, yeah. Anyway.
One of those two, anyways. What he's suggesting is that to make up for the lack of tax revenue, which is theft, well, according to you, anyways, to make up for the lack of tax revenue of the workers that are no longer working in those fields, companies should pay taxes for using robots instead of hiring workers. And I think that is an incredibly stupid idea. I think you'd agree with me there, Ben?
Yes.
And of course, you disagree with tax as a matter of principle. And I don't necessarily take that path, but in terms of this, I do disagree with the taxing on robots. I mean, not only would that discourage the use of robots, but it's kind of like punishing advances in technology. And I mean, the thing with humanity is that you want to reward advances as much as possible, because rewards and all this ingenuity, it breeds solutions to problems. You slow that process down, and you're essentially going to become as stagnant as like the Middle Ages were after the Roman Empire. Because I mean, if you look at technology level, the Roman Empire was up there, man. And then it kind of like plummeted, and it took the Europeans until the Renaissance and rediscovering the greatness of the Roman Empire until they finally were able to somewhat catch up and say, I don't know, 16th century or something like that. Just goes to show that you should never kind of stop this advancement. You should never punish it. You should let it roll out. And of course, I can understand what they're trying to do with the robot tax, because they're going to say robots will replace the labor force, we won't be able to do income taxes. Where will government get its money from? And that is a valid question. And there's a couple of other suggested solutions to that. One of them is mass retraining of irrelevant workers. And by irrelevant workers, I mean people who have had their jobs displaced because of automation. So it's kind of like, hey, you used to lay bricks, well, you're useless now. I'm going to teach you how to be a social worker. We're going to teach you how to be a physiotherapist or something. And to be frank, I'm not sure if people in their 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, or 60s have the will, intelligence, or any of that to be able to essentially go back to school in like a SAGEP/university kind of thing and get a degree. Because not only is that expensive, but they won't have, any kind of real job while they're doing that, which means they're going to have to take out a government loan. Sounds like a conspiracy to me. But if they want to get retrained, they got to take out a loan, pay the government, if they're lucky, they'll get it, and then they're going to be repeating what they did when they're like maybe 18, 19 years old, paying off the loan of, being a student, except for now they're going to be 30s, 40s, 50s. And nobody wants to do that, and even then there's no guarantee that the job they trained for will even be around by the time they get it. Now, of course, there are some fields that I think are more safe than others in terms of automation. For example, people love to say stuff like, my job is safe, robots will never replace us, they could never replace us, but the fact is, for the most part, they could. Even in things such as teachers, a lot of people are of the opinion that, what's the point of coming to class when you could just ask Siri what a math question answer is, or you could ask Siri what happened in 1874, or you could ask Siri all these questions. If Siri is an endless wealth of knowledge, why not just have Siri teach you everything in the comfort of your own home and then take a standardized test at the end of it? And I think that is not the answer, because I think if you don't go to school, you're going to end up with a whole lot more uneducated people, because, quite frankly, I don't think they have the discipline to educate themselves. I mean, it takes definitely a certain level of discipline. And you get these, children, because that's what they're going to be at 20 years old, with no education and no work prospects. And what are you going to do with them? Are you going to feed them for free with hard-working taxpayer money? I don't think so. Are they going to just bleed their parents dry until they run out of retirement money? I mean, that does not sound like a good future to me, Ben.
We need some apprenticeship programs. So, I suppose I'd like to tackle this as an economic fallacy.
Sure, go ahead.
So this whole thing about robots are taking your jobs, there's going to be less jobs, it's false. My philosophy teacher is obsessed with this. She says all the time, it's the robots, not the Chinese, who are taking your jobs.
That's fake news, Ben, that's fake news.
Neither are taking your jobs, okay? You see, these robots that do these things need to be built. And who's going to do that? Somebody's got to do that.
Well, what if they say more robots will? I mean, technically, there's always got to be humans involved in the process, but what if they kind of try to convince you the robots will be trained to make their own robots and humans will eventually have no jobs at all? What would you say to that, Ben?
I think that's going to be that's a big cycle, isn't it? And that would take a long, long time to reach that point. And somebody is always going to have to be making up the next type of robot to make this other type of robot and stuff like that.
Alright, so Ben, I think we need to talk about one of the fundamentals of this issue. A lot of people have expressed concern over the possibility of robots becoming too intelligent, especially with the prominence of AI in the news these days. People are starting to get scared that if we continue this research, we're going to reach, I believe it's called the, what's the name of that point? The,
I don't know, turning point? Point of no return?
Not the catalyst, but the,
climax?
No. It's a term specifically designed to AIs becoming capable of more microprocesses than humans.
I don't know.
I'm going to search this up later because it bothers me that I can't think of the term. But people are afraid of that point, and people are starting to become convinced that this continued, advancement in artificial intelligence will eventually be the humans' undoing, because they think that the humans will essentially just end up being seen as a problem to the robots, and the robots will realize that in order to secure their own existence, they'll get rid of us. Now, of course, Ben, you don't believe that robots/artificial intelligence will ever be capable of this, right?
No, not on their own, unless it's programmed into them that they have some sort of survival instinct, or programmed into them that they want to rule, or some kind of emotions are programmed into them or something like that.
Is such a thing even possible?
Well, they wouldn't actually experience anything. There wouldn't be any person there to experience something, but the effects of the emotions would be seen.
So it would essentially be simulating human characteristics, giving people the impression that they are artificially intelligent, that they are, conscious and all that stuff.
Yeah, they can't actually be conscious. They can just give the illusion of consciousness.
Alright, now that is interesting because, quite frankly, the thing with these kind of things is, it is hypothetical. I think you'll agree with me on that, the idea of artificial intelligence reaching that point. And I suppose as a point of principle, you could say that they're never going to replace that. However, at least for me, I still have to consider it a distinct possibility, and quite frankly, I have no problem with using more and more advanced tools to help us out, but I do agree, and Elon Musk is of the opinion of this, that we should maybe, not in terms of automation, but in terms of artificial intelligence, slow down, or at the very least, not keep advancing at the pace we're doing, because just the possibility, I'm not saying it's absolutely going to happen, but the risk, the possibility of such a thing like that happening, it's too dangerous to keep going. And of course, there's money to be made, so people will keep progressing in it, but to me, that's a real danger. I see it as a danger, Ben.
Okay. Well, I suppose it's dangerous if certain people have their hands on it. But if you're building a robot that doesn't have the capacity to do anything like this, then there is no problem, really.
Ooh, the term is the singularity, I'm sorry. That was the term I was thinking of.
Isn't that like what's in a black hole?
I suppose so, but it's a quaint term to describe, of course, when the robot becomes capable of more microprocesses than the human brain. But, sorry.
It's like that's a long way off.
Well, I mean, you could say that, but certain estimates, and I have no idea how they determine these estimates, but certain estimates have it being in the next 20 years, some people say in the next 50 years. I'm not sure if such a thing is realistically attainable, but we've seen massive advances in this technology in the past, and I think at the very least, it's concerning.
I've heard it said, I'm not sure this is true, but I've heard it said that there are more synapses in the human brain than there are electrical connections on Earth. So, if so, this is going to be a long ways off.
I suppose so. Neither of us are experts in the field of artificial intelligence, and you know what? If it is a far way off, that's great. That is an absolute great thing. I think that robots, they're tools. They're not equals. I mean, I don't even want to get into the subject of if they become conscious and, sentient and all that jazz. But right now, and hypothetically forever, they are tools for humans to use to increase, rates of production. And there's nothing wrong with that. You don't feel bad for your toaster when you toast with it. And why would you? It's a tool. So what's the difference between a toaster and an AI bot with a human face? And the difference is that the AI bot looks human. And people do that on purpose to try to, initiate conversation, make the people feel more relaxed talking to it. When in reality, all it really is the sum of its programming. And the great thing about robots, or I guess not such a great thing, is that they're limited by their programming. They could never become more than it. And that's our safety net. I think that as long as that's how robots work, that's completely fine. But if they start somehow doing more than that, that's where the danger is. And people keep talking about, there's these two robots that Facebook was doing where they started communicating with their own secret language that humans couldn't decipher. And they said what seemed like nonsense to us, but they kind of formed their own language for them. So they immediately unplugged the robots because they're thinking, what are they talking about? It's too risky. For all we know, they're plotting the end of the world. Seems a bit far off, but when robots start doing stuff like that, interacting with each other in ways that humans can't understand, I think it becomes dangerous enough to justify the ending of the robots. Because, they're not living things. I don't feel bad plugging it out. A human, I feel bad about killing a robot. What is a robot other than, microprocessing? It's just a bunch of chips and metal and stuff. I don't feel bad about it.
I heard something about some leftists trying to give a river rights, so you never know what's going to happen here.
Well, speaking about rights and unsentient objects and stuff, apparently there's this robot in Saudi Arabia that has the right to vote. And what's interesting
who's it programmed to vote for?
Well, that's the question. But the thing with a robot is that it has the right to vote. It's a female robot, yet real women in the country don't have the right to vote.
Well, I suppose robots don't have actual genders, so...
Well, of course not. If you want to talk about gender neutral, you don't talk about a girl with a shaved head. You talk about a robot. There's a difference here, folks. There are two genders, and there's robots. Humans are not robots. Robots are not humans. Deal with it.
What if somebody identifies as a robot?
Well, I choose to disrespect bill, I think it's C-106, the one that forces me to address people by their preferred pronouns. So
I think it's Bill C-16.
Oh, never mind. C-16-106 is the anti-hate speech law.
Oh yeah, that was M-106, wasn't it?
M-106. Well, anyways, yeah, C-16, yeah, I don't need to call people by their preferred pronouns, so if you identify as a robot, I identify you as your gender, and there's nothing you could do to change that. You could...
Well, Ontario can send you to jail, or fine you, or whatever they do.
Well, if the government wants to send me to jail for something like that, I hope that I cause enough uproar to maybe get some recognition. I mean, if you start sending people to jail for stuff like that, I know we're off topic here, but if you start sending the people for jail because they won't call someone by their preferred pronoun, and you might as well call it a fascist state right now and then. And I mean, the UK puts people in jail for viewing far-right things on social media and YouTube. And quite frankly, you call this the free world? I don't know. Is it really that different than, fake democracy Russia, where, if you disagree with the government, then you get silenced, but if you agree with them, it's all good? In this country, if you agree with all the progressiveness, then you're fine, you don't need to worry about anything, but as soon as you oppose the prevailing view, all of a sudden you're evil, you're a villain, you're the cause of all problems in this world, Ben, and you must be eradicated because everybody else is a victim, and that entitles the victims to have a massacre against the oppressors. And you know what, Ben? It's the white people that are being called the oppressors, and not even just white people, it's mostly just white men, and, some of the women that side with the men. I mean, they're basically, it's some kind of gender revenge thing, or race revenge thing. It makes no sense, quite frankly.
Yeah, like, not Uganda. What's the place?
Rwanda.
Yeah, Rwanda.
Yeah,
so they had the gender revenge massacre.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. Jordan Peterson actually goes into this in some of his videos. But he basically explains how, especially in communist countries, what an intellectual will do is an intellectual will go to a place, look for people that feel like they're victims, look for people that feel like they're oppressed. They're going to justify their oppression, saying, yes, you are oppressed, you are the ones feeling issues. And then they'll try to rile them up into thinking, you are the poor people, you're the oppressed, you are entitled to have what they have wrongly stolen from you, those evil rich people. Oh, no, 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 no. And what they'll do is they'll rile them up until you have the majority of a population turning on the producing members of society, the farmers, the local landowning farmers, the, small businesses. They're the real victims of all this. And the thing with that is that it's very easy to take people that feel like they're oppressed, and quite frankly, I think by definition everybody's oppressed in one way or another. It's just some people actually want to contribute to society and not spend their days dyeing their hair living in their parents' basement complaining about the patriarchy. But anyways, some of us actually want to contribute to society, and because we contribute to society, we're the enemy to that oppressed minority. And quite frankly, it's the oppressed majority these days. Everybody feels oppressed. Everybody wants to identify that way. And as soon as you got that kind of a group mentality going, we're the oppressed, we're the victims here, it becomes super easy to justify, violent action, saying, we will take what's rightfully ours. We will take the white farmers' land in South Africa. We will take the money from the rich white people and redistribute it to all the Aboriginal people in Canada. And I mean, if you think about that for a second, you'll realize how stupid that is. I mean, that's redistribution of wealth, and that is not capitalism, and that's communism, but quite frankly, that's National Socialism as well, and we talked about this last episode, but if a government takes stuff and redistributes it at their own whim, and first of all, you have to wonder, what does the government get out of it, other than public support, but second of all, that's way more power than a government should ever have. And if a government could convince people to let them do something like this, it's already over, Ben. If a government plays to a majority's victim complex in order to let them do things that the law would normally let them do, democracy is over. It's already done.
What a rant. And I think I agreed with pretty much all of it. Well, I guess if you have nothing left to say, we better cut it off now.
Yeah, hold on a sec. Yeah, that is a good idea. We didn't get a chance to go into technocracy or absolute monarchy, but that'll be on next week's episode. I know you have a lot to say about absolute monarchy, and I'll do some research about technocracy. We could go further into the question of morality if you want to do some more research on the morality and ethics, because it is an interesting and very polarizing issue. And I think that debatably you could say this, but it's not an easy thing to answer.
Right. I'm hoping I can eventually come up with some complete moral system that'll finally that development that everybody's been waiting for thousands of years.
And I have two questions for you in regards to that, Ben. Do you think such a thing is possible? And once you develop it, will it be unchangeable? Will it be like the American Constitution where it stays like that forever? Or is it, is it able to be changed for whatever reason? Will it be the kind of thing that no matter what, that's perfection, you can't argue with it, that's just the way it's got to be? Or will it be changed? And how would you change it? Why would you change it? And give me something on that.
I think it's possible. I'm not sure. But as for is it changeable, well, I think I probably, with almost certainly, I would not be able to come up with everything for it all by myself, and so other people would in the future develop it further. But it wouldn't, the moral laws basically would not change.
Okay, so the principles would never change, and that's what's really important here, the principles, right?
Right.
All right, well, I myself am a man of principles, so I do approve of that.
Right. Well, I'm Ben.
And I'm Thomas.
And this was the Philosophy Show, Episode 3. And taxation is theft.
Tune in next week. Bye.